thanks so much for being here at our webinar today, part of the BECP webinar series. And today we'll be talking about existing buildings. So we'll look at building performance standards and implementation support tools. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few logistics. So everybody should be in listen only mode right now. And if you have any logistical questions, you can throw them in the chat. If you have questions for any of our speakers or presenters, we will ask you to use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen right there. Just throw your question in there, and if possible, say who you are wanting to ask the question to. We're going to have a Q&A at the end here, so we'll try to get to all those questions and make sure they go to the right person at that time. And this webinar is being recorded, as you probably have noticed. We're going to have that recording be up on the website next week. It'll be at the same place where you found information for this webinar, and I'll put the chat or the link to that in the chat in a little bit as well. And finally, something people are probably interested in is CEUs that we're offering. So we offer AIA LUs, as well as certificates that you can use for self-reporting to ICC or other organizations. So in order to get those CEUs, just stick around to the end of the webinar. We will put a link in the chat. If you go to that link, fill out the form, let us know if you need a certificate or AIA. You can provide your AIA number there, and we'll make sure you get those by next week as well. So yeah, just keep an eye on the chat for that link. I'll be putting that in there a little bit later. We have a few other we have one other webinar scheduled actually, and then we'll be announcing a new batch of webinars. So our next one is going to be about energy code enforcement in rural communities. So that'll be next month on the third Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. So that'll be on March 21st. And finally, I wanted to just shout out the the National Energy Codes Conference that we have coming up in May. That is hosted by the Department of Energy. I'll throw a link in the chat for that as well. It's called the National Energy Codes Conference, but it does cover a wider variety of topics besides just energy codes. So we'll be talking about building energy and other topics as well, including BPS at the conference. I believe registration and hotel registration is open now, but go to that link, take a look. And that one will be taking place in May in person in Sacramento. We have that one every year. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. I think that's all from me. Thank you all for being here. We have a really great lineup of presenters, and I'm going to pass it over to Billierae Engelman from the Department of Energy, who's going to give us some more info and introduce our speakers. So over to you, Billierae.
Great, thanks, Corey. Glad to be here. If you'll just give me 1 second, I will share my screen and we'll get going. All right, hoping everybody can see this. Again, thank you all for having us today. I and my colleagues who are joining me are going to be speaking about building performance standards as one of the ways to address energy reduction and carbon reduction in existing buildings across our nation. My name is Billierae Engelman. I work for the U.S. Department of Energy within our Building Technologies Office, alongside my colleagues in the Building Energy Codes program and the Commercial Buildings team as well. I will very much try to speak not in acronyms as we move forward, but if anybody has any questions, please let me know. Great. So today I'll introduce our speakers that we have here. And then just a quick review of the agenda. We'll go through kind of the major elements of what we see around building performance standards, some of the federal resources available, And then we'll dive into some subtopics. Again, as Corey said, if you have any questions, please throw them in the Q&A. We will have time at the end to answer some of those live, and we'll also be monitoring those across the time as well. So I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleagues from the U.S. Department of Energy, Harry Bergmann and Sydney Applegate. And then we are also joined by 3 of our national lab colleagues, Joshua Kace from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Isabel Langlois-Romero from the National Renewable Energy Lab. My apologies, too many words there. And Molly Curtz from the Pacific Northwest National Lab. So to dive in, as I'm sure all of you on this call know, buildings are critical to our US climate goals. But in particular, there's a couple of stats that I think are quite reflective of how critical buildings are. The first being that commercial and residential buildings make up 13% of US greenhouse gas emissions across all of the different sectors. Then more particularly, the buildings that are built today, for the most part, will still be here in 2050. So we're seeing quite a lot of focus and energy being put towards existing buildings in particular. And I and others on this call, I'm sure you all can share the sentiment with me, but we deeply love building energy codes. Those are critical. They have moved the market in terms of energy performance over the years. However, for the most part, building energy codes are not touching the majority of existing buildings. And the voluntary retrofit rate that we've seen in the past really just isn't cutting it to make our climate and energy goals as a country. And so building performance standards have come in as one of these policy mechanisms to connect the gap between the building energy codes world and these voluntary retrofit rates over the life cycle of existing buildings. In January of 2022, President Biden launched the National Building Performance Standards Coalition. So this was a coalition of 33 state and local governments that have publicly committed to passing a building performance standard by Earth Day 2024. So that's this April. Since then, this coalition has actually grown to over, I think we're hovering around 45 or so jurisdictions. So there's a lot of momentum and interest in these policies. But what exactly is a building performance standard at this point? So this is kind of a high level overview for folks. We certainly encourage you to check out a bunch of the resources that we have online. I'll highlight some of those in particular, but in short, building performance standards are a combination of covered buildings, so those buildings subject to the policy, usually by building type and size. And then it is a selected metric by which to judge that building. So usually it's site energy use intensity. It can also be greenhouse gas intensity, and we've seen a handful of others as well. And then there's a timeline of compliance set up as well, whether it's 1 year of compliance all the way up to, we've seen 5 or 6 years of a compliance period being selected by different jurisdictions. And all of that is in service of meeting these performance targets that are set by the policy and improving the existing buildings that are covered by that policy. We do see a lot of alternative compliance pathways being designed for these policies, especially to provide flexibility and equitable implementation. And so we see things like audit requirements in lieu of or in support of the performance targets. We see timeline extensions, especially for building types like affordable multifamily housing, where the financing structures don't quite line up with the original compliance timelines. Those types of things to really be able to include as many buildings as possible in the policies, but still recognize individual circumstance. And as I mentioned before, we see over 40 policies are being considered, and those jurisdictions mostly have joined the national coalition at this time. But over 14 have been adopted at this point. So we're definitely seeing a lot of momentum in this space, which is very exciting. In terms of the federal resources that are available, the Department of Energy has stood up alongside our colleagues in the Environmental Protection Agency a technical assistance network for building performance standards that is open to any and all state or local jurisdictions who are interested, already adopting or implementing these types of policies. And that is both for jurisdictions that are in the coalition and also those who are not in for whatever reason. And this technical assistance network supports a variety of different activities, technical analysis of the policies being a key one, but also implementation structure support and data tool technical assistance for the suite of software tools that we offer, policy design support, and many, many more. So for state and local jurisdictions that are out there on this call today, please definitely feel free to reach out if you have any questions. We're happy to chat. I did want to highlight a couple of specific resources that the Department of Energy and in conjunction with ASHRAE has released for one of them. That's our DOE and ASHRAE Building Performance Standards Technical Guidance. This report goes into a ton of detail on building performance standards, and we definitely encourage folks to read through it if there is more interest here. That is a free report that you can access through this link, and I know the slides will be sent out later. But I also wanted to highlight a recently released commercial building stock segmentation analysis that we have released with our colleagues over at NREL. This is phase one of this analysis that provides basic building stock data across 88 geographic clusters. And we have a phase two forthcoming as well for that report. And we definitely encourage folks to check that out. I put the link in the slides here as well. And we have a ton of other resources listed on our website. We also use the energycodes.gov web pages, the same as our colleagues in the codes program. And we have a ton of resources in our resource library, as well as other information and technical assistance support. I also did want to quickly highlight, we released the first set of awards under our bipartisan infrastructure law funding of the resilient and efficient, oh no, too many acronyms, sorry. Our resilient and efficient codes implementation funding opportunity. So 27 of those projects were awarded the past couple of months across 26 states and the District of Columbia. And within those, there were 7 projects that were either directly working on building performance standards or in an adjacent section. So we're very excited about these projects and their overall impact in this space. And from that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Harry Bergmann.
Great, thank you, Billierae. Hi, everyone. I am Harry Bergmann. I am over in the State and Community Energy Programs Office here at DOE, and we're working on all of the codes funding that came out as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'm just going to talk for a minute or two about the funding opportunities that we have on the street and how sort of BPS fits into that landscape, and make sure that y'all are up to date on everything around IRA codes funding. Next slide, please. So there are 2 major parts of the program. One part is formula funding and the other part is competitive. You can see in between blue and yellow here, the blue slices of the pie here are the latest model energy codes. And then the yellow is for 0 energy codes, and these amounts were specified by the statute. And so what we did is we took those chunks of funds and split them into a formula program, and that is open to all states and territories in the District of Columbia, and then a competitive funding opportunity that's open to states, territories, the District of Columbia, and local governments with the authority to adopt building energy codes. So most recently, we had the competitive funding opportunity out on the street. This is a rolling opportunity that's going to be open for about the next 18 months or until funding runs out. Thank you to everybody who put in concept papers for our first wave That deadline was last week. So really excited to be reviewing all of those. And for folks that missed that deadline, the next window is already open. So feel free to dig in, submit those concept papers, and we'll have more information shortly about sort of what that cutoff point is for the next round of concept paper reviews. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about around the competitive funding is that there are 3 topic areas. Topic area 1 is specifically for local governments, and it is sort of this streamlined path that looks a lot like the formula opportunity for states and territories. Basically, this is saying we want to adopt the latest model code, or we want to adopt the zero energy code basically by the book, or with some strengthening amendments or neutral amendments like saying EV ready or PV ready. That's topic area 1, you're good to go. Topic area 2 is looking at new construction, major renovation codes. So sort of your classic building energy code, and they could be amended with strengthening and weakening amendments. There could be different neutral amendments in there like EV and PV ready. It could also be a fully custom code if you're looking to build something unique from the ground up. Topic area 2 is for you. And then topic area 3 is what we are calling innovative approaches to building energy codes and innovative codes. And this is where we're looking at things like building energy codes for existing buildings or building performance standards. And that is open to states and local governments with the authority to adopt building codes. And then within each of these topic areas, you can apply for funding based on energy savings that will be equivalent to the latest code, or energy savings that are equivalent to zero energy codes. This is really just a high-level skim of the topic areas and sort of what this program looks like. If we go to the next slide, there is an email address here. Feel free to email us there with any questions. Answers are posted through an FAQ process that's described in the funding opportunity. And then I'll be sure to drop a link to our program page in the chat here, where everyone can look at the formula opportunity, the competitive funding opportunity, and learn more sort of broadly about the IRA codes program. But just to address one question that came in through the chat, the deadline for the next round of concept papers has not yet been set, but because it is a rolling FOA, that submission window is open. So if that's something where you didn't get this first deadline that was last week, the door is already open to be able to submit your concept paper to be in the second round. And so we'll be coming out, I think, in the next few weeks with more information on that exact timing. Yeah, so that's what I have for you. Thank you so much for letting me join, and looking forward to the rest of the presentations.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Harry. Okay, so subtopic time. I get the lovely honor of talking about software here. So just want to start us off with probably the most important point that I will say the whole time, which is really trying to emphasize the importance here of data management as it relates to data-heavy policies like building performance standards. So really trying to get folks away from spreadsheets, local computer files, and towards easy-to-use software data tools that can handle the complexity of building performance standard data. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to dig in briefly here about each of the software that exists within this suite or ecosystem supporting building performance standards. All of the tools you see here are free. Some of them are also open source. Start off with here, going from top to bottom. First one here is EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So this is an EPA land, but we do work very closely with our colleagues over there, and they're very much in this nest and ecosystem. So Energy Star Portfolio Manager enables the reporting of building energy and water use, square footage, operational details in a consistent format, which is going to be a key phrase there we'll be hitting on a couple times throughout the presentation. Companies and utilities can directly push energy consumption and other data into portfolio manager accounts to make benchmarking and other tracking easier. The tool also offers a number of other capabilities, including third-party verification, custom local emissions factors, location and market-based emissions calculations, goal setting, tracking, other things of that nature. EPA is also planning some more enhancements to come out here in the next year or two. Very exciting. Okay, and so I'll be going into a bit more detail about seed and audit template in a bit. So just to give you just enough context until then. So SEED is the standard energy efficiency database platform. So SEED platform, which is a central database for jurisdictional building energy policy or program data. It merges data from portfolio manager, audit template, and other city data sets into one place through APIs behind one intuitive interface. Audit template, in the same way that portfolio manager is that standardized reporting mechanism for energy use, audit template is a parallel pathway for audit and asset-based data collection. UBID, which stands for Unique Building Identifier, generates unique building identifiers or UBIDs for each building from geospatial data that can be applied across data sources, including a list of covered buildings, tax assessor records, or other jurisdiction data sets. Assigning UBIDs to buildings or campuses allows object-specific data to be cross-referenced and clearly matched across data sets and tracking systems. It also resolves inconsistencies rooted in using addresses as a building identifier, which is a major data quality win. UBID, in summary, supports building performance standards by standardizing building identification across data sets. Next slide. Okay, so now that we all know what each of these tools are, how do they fit together? This is what we've really been working on over here at DOE, trying to provide a comprehensive ecosystem to make submission, reporting, and management of data related to building performance standards as seamless as possible. So really for these two user groups here on the left side of the screen, ordinance or building performance standard administrators, or building owners, auditors, and managers. So if you're a building owner in a jurisdiction with a building performance standard, you're really going to be focusing on that second set of tools around data collection, either energy data through portfolio manager or asset-based or audit information through audit template. If you already have third-party platforms, those really do interact well with the rest of the ecosystem. So just trying to make sure that nothing is a barrier to data submission for that category of users. UBID being that standardization across this suite of tools, making sure everything works really well here in the background. And then if you are an ordinance or building performance standard administrator, the focus there is going to be on data management. There's a lot of different forms of data coming in from a lot of different sources. So really having that power through SEED to be able to aggregate, centralize, and then review and QA, QC that data in an automatic fashion, and then analyze the data in a way that is relevant for your compliance and reporting tracking. SEED does send automatic emails to building owners, but if you are a larger jurisdiction or have a more complex system of talking to your building owners, SEED does also talk to CRMs or customer relationship managers. So just again, emphasizing the importance of data sharing amongst all of these tools here, ensuring that data is flowing seamlessly through API connections, importing, exporting, and data sharing. Really making that as seamless as possible for jurisdictions, building owners, and auditors. And the goal here at DOE is to save jurisdictions cost and staff time, focusing on removing the barriers of implementing a building performance standard and reducing the administrative burdens. Also ensuring transparency in the event of personnel changes or need to share program or policy outcomes with public stakeholders, for instance, on a dashboard. Next slide. Okay, so these are the jurisdictions across the country as well as in Canada that have adopted the DOE side of the software ecosystem or suite. Here, as of September 2023, we've had a few more jurisdictions come on since September, but here are the lovely folks that we are currently working with and would love to work with some more folks on the line as well today. Next slide. Okay, so audit template. To dive into a bit more detail on audit template and SEED. Audit template is a web-based interface for collecting and reporting of building asset data. So broad category there, including information on building systems, energy use data, which can come from portfolio manager, and information on energy efficiency measures and potential energy savings. The generated asset data report may be submitted to jurisdictions or agencies to demonstrate audit completion or submission to any asset-based alternative compliance pathway. Categories that DC uses is here on the right side of the screen, and then that report that is sent to a jurisdiction you can see on the left side of the screen. Audit template is designed to be customizable for program administrators or agencies to include characteristics and details they deem valuable. Audit template enables standardized and persistent building data collection, running a history of audits at a building integrated with any future audits and retrofit activity, really trying to move folks away from the 3-ring binder sitting on the shelf. Next slide. Okay, so last slide here for me today. SEED, again, is that central database for tracking jurisdictional building energy policy and program data. SEED leverages automatic API connections with Energy Star Portfolio Manager, Audit Template, UBID, and other software to send and receive data seamlessly, very important as that central data aggregator. SEED also automates spreadsheet-based workflows to simplify data management and can improve data quality while reducing staff time spent managing programs by over 25%. SEED tracks benchmarking or building performance standard compliance and progress and can send automated emails to building owners to communicate data quality issues or compliance status. If a jurisdiction uses a customer relationship manager to manage building owner contact information, SEED can connect and share data with that platform. I said that already, but just want to emphasize because that is a significant chunk of what some jurisdictions spend time on doing. So really want to be able to cut back on time doing that and focusing on other tasks. With SEED, a jurisdiction maintains ownership of their data, keeps their data secure and private, and converts building data sets into actionable insights. All right, next slide. I will just leave you here today with a few links, which I can also definitely drop into the chat. More information about the suite as well as specific tools and links to our Q&A platforms, or if you would like to request a one-on-one demonstration with any of our lab staff, be more than happy to talk with you after the call. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us here. Thanks, Sydney, for that overview of the wonderful DOE data tools ecosystem. I'm Joshua Kace. I'm a technology researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm going to be shifting gears a little bit from the software side of BPS implementation into the human side of BPS implementation. Obviously, there's a lot of interplay there, and it's important to make sure that you're taking into account what you can save in time with the team that you look to build out as part of your BPS implementation. So everything I'm going to be presenting here today is content from a guide that we published last year. This guide, I'm actually going to throw it in the chat right now, is a wonderful overview of a lot of the lessons learned. So it's about a 6-month-long effort working with jurisdictions that have implemented BPS or in the process of implementing BPS. A lot of the lessons learned and itemization of the a lot of the detail, challenges and opportunities associated with standing up and executing on BPS implementation. And so next slide. We break down, and this is the overall structure of the guide as well. We break down BPS implementation and administration into several categories here. The first couple are really about itemizing all of the responsibilities associated with successful implementation. So this is everything you need to stand up your program and to maintain it successfully moving forward. The third section dives into the staffing associated with those responsibilities. So you have a list of things you have to do. What are the qualifications, experience that you need to execute on each of those, and the associated team members, both internal and external to your team that will be there to make it happen. And then I'll close out with some of the really super valuable best practices and tips that we got working with jurisdictions and some of their lessons learned. So you could hop to the next slide. So this list may seem a little bit overwhelming, and I do recommend that you look at the guide. I don't expect all of you to memorize this list. And given the limited time today, I'm not going to run through each of these individually, but the goal here is really just to make sure that you're understanding all of the steps that are involved and not underestimating any of them. I'll highlight a couple here. And we have a couple slides that dive a little deeper into a couple of the key ones. But verbally, I'll just highlight covered buildings list. So one new acronym for you is a CBL. And this is something that varies a lot jurisdiction to jurisdiction when it comes to the amount of time and effort it takes to create your initial list of buildings. Although it may sound simple, I'm sure a lot of you on the line have some experience with this. It's not always as straightforward as you think when you get to the individual building level, making sure you have good contact information and enough characteristic information to know whether a building would or would not be covered by your BPS policy. So that's something we get into within the guide and also other resources. The initial notifications as well. So as Sydney was mentioning, the Seed platform is fantastic for this in terms of being able to deliver email notifications to individual buildings. But it could also, often extend beyond email into other forms of communication to make sure that you're being fully inclusive with your outreach and reaching all the buildings that need the information. And then we have a couple slides here that get into some of the details. So you can go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about help desk. So this is one where we do see a lot of variability policy to policy in terms of the depth and complexity of help desk support that's provided to buildings. Within the guide, we break it down into a few different tiers of help desk scope. We think this is important to sort of establish expectations early and also make sure that referral programming is set up. You're not on an island with this work. I'll mention that a couple of times as we go. And because of that, know what you need to do internally, but also know what you can lean on other entities within your ecosystem to support on some of these help desk items. Next slide. Another important early step is making sure that you leave no stone unturned when it comes to the initial data sets that you use as the starting point for your BPS. That is inclusive of the CBL, but not limited to it. There's certainly each of the categories we show on the slide here, you may or may not have within your region, but chances are there is some semblance of a data starting point that you can use to help build out the foundation of your policy. And so these are the four categories we typically recommend people look into as part of their initial scoping process. Next slide. Getting into the ongoing responsibilities. So startup responsibilities, we just had a big laundry list. For ongoing responsibilities, we get a little into categorizing them by the scalability of each of those responsibilities. So the first list here, this first bucket is really things that need to be done on an ongoing basis that are need to be done regardless of how many buildings you're looking to cover with your policy. There's also a subset here of responsibilities that scale pretty dramatically with the number of buildings that you have covered by your policy. And so if you are a jurisdiction big or small, you need to be worried about this first set. And then, this second set of tasks is really around, if you have a small number of buildings, that's not going to be as intensive of an effort to handle those. But the more buildings you have, the more staff partnerships and team you're going to need in order to execute successfully on an ongoing basis. And obviously the guide gets into a lot more detail across the board here. Next slide. Supporting equity. This is another step of the process that can be underestimated early on. And I will be, handing off to my colleague Isabel. We'll get a lot deeper into some of the great work that's happening around equity of BPS policy. But that, for the purposes of this section, it's really important just to make sure that when you're building your policy and you're building your team, you're doing so in a way that allows for equitable implementation of your policy. Make sure that you're not leaving buildings behind, making sure that all buildings are really benefiting from the investments that will happen in buildings as a result of the BPS policy, and that everyone has a lot of time and energy. Beyond that, geographically nested policies may not apply to everyone, but when you have a state level BPS, a city level BPS within the same region, making sure those are coordinated is critically important. Workforce development and also connections to energy code program offices. Again, these are ways that you can set your BPS program up for success. And focusing on them early in the process allows you to have a good plan on that front. So making sure you are looking down all these avenues, and more detail is available. You can hop to the next slide. Within our guide here. So I included the link in the chat for anyone who's interested in downloading it. And if you have any questions beyond what's in the guide, we're very excited to help support you all in your BPS scoping efforts. So that's it for me, and I'll be handing it off to Isabel to talk through some great work on equity.
Awesome. Thank you, Joshua. Hola, mi nombre es Isabel Langlois-Romero. Hi, my name is Isabel Langlois-Romero. I'll be speaking a little bit about equity in BPS. So we've got about 10 minutes to kind of overview all things equity, right? Just kidding. We'll touch on some of the kind of overview topics and then kind of dive in and highlight a few. I didn't realize how nice it would be kind of to go after Josh's implementation guide, because I think with some of the implementation practices in mind, reviewing the equity considerations for BPS, we can kind of think of how we can kind of reimagine what Josh was talking about with different equity practices in mind. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we'll explore some of the high-level opportunities for the equitable implementation of building performance standards. Then we'll go into a few different snapshots of these equitable practices in place in different jurisdictions around the US. And then after that, we'll highlight some research we're performing over at NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to support jurisdictions, and then a few things that the TA network in general are also standing up for you guys. Next slide. Awesome. So here's just a few kind of overview items for different equity considerations in building performance standards. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. There are, for example, you don't see anything here about affordable housing, but there are some of these tasks kind of inform detailed research later on surrounding equity. So that was kind of by choice, starting with some broad things, and we'll kind of dive into how they're applicable. And so you see here coalition building, stakeholder engagement, dedicated staff like equity administrators who can really own some of this work, and then program evaluation for equity considerations. Next slide. And those with the asterisks we'll kind of dive into a little bit more. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so our first kind of topic that we're going to be investigating is stakeholder engagement in building performance standards. So this is something that our labs are coming up with a guide for as well. But I think, at each phase of implementation for building performance standards, from planning to policy adoption, there's different types of engagement opportunities and activities associated. So I have a few of them listed here, kind of in the preparation phases, right? You're performing this initial outreach, you're building a coalition of people who will be co-creating these policies with you. And so I have here at the top, also just kind of a reminder, we're always kind of shooting from engagement, or for that ownership, in this spectrum of engagement to ownership, we really want to be employing co-creation practices. And this isn't just because it's a fancy fashionable thing. It also, it comes up with better outcomes for the policy, right? Okay, next slide. So our first kind of snapshot here is on Boston, Massachusetts. And you can see here that they've also kind of organized their outreach and engagement along a timeline. They have kind of a phased approach. And all of this is also just after they've passed the policy. So once the policy is in place, there's still a good bit of outreach and ongoing outreach to be performing. So you can see once the policy was in place, they have public listening sessions and public hearings, and this is over a 3-year period. In this next phase, you have community-led working groups and technical groups. So you start to see also that there's a diversity in the types of outreach that they're performing, because there's a diversity in the stakeholders that they're engaging with. And so in this third phased approach, you also see community advisory groups. We're going to put a pin on that and talk about that in the next slide. But you also have technical working sessions, focus groups, and resident meetings. And that kind of speaks to that diversity in the types of stakeholders that are engaged in building performance standards. So building performance standards really, they impact both building owners, building tenants, and the community members at large. Next slide. So coming back to that kind of community board, Boston also stood up what's called in their jurisdiction, what's called a review board. And these are they have the legal authority to convene their own working groups on key topics. And they also provide that kind of co-creation in practice, right? So it's a permanent voice for community members, and they provide oversight on the policy over the lifetime of the policy. And so you can see here in this snapshot that there's kind of a diverse background of members who are part of these boards. And they're also, from different sectors, right? They may be from environmental justice, racial equity sectors, or sustainability directors. Okay, next slide. Thanks. Okay, so the next topic that we're going to kind of highlight here is equity portfolio prioritization. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but this really speaks to what Josh was mentioning about the covered buildings list. So if the covered buildings list is one of those first kind of initial startup activities, another iteration of that covered buildings list is ensuring that you have equity information associated with each of those properties so that you can prioritize upgrades or resources for the real buildings and real people who need those resources to comply with the policy and then to experience the benefits of the building performance standard. And so some of the ways that you can create portfolio prioritizations are on federal or local equity considerations. And so we're going to kind of briefly talk about some of the equity indexes that are created that bring together different local and federal equity considerations. Next slide. All right, so our next snapshot here is about Denver, Colorado. And Denver created what they have coined equity priority buildings. And this is a combination of both local equity metrics and federal equity considerations. So the federal equity consideration really is speaking to the White House's definition of census tracts who are disadvantaged communities, right? And then the local equity metrics we can see here in this list, the various different types of local considerations that they used to identify equity priority buildings. So these are specific buildings and specific people that they can speak to create policies and programs and financial mechanisms to help support compliance. And so Denver also pre-identified these buildings so that they could create these policies early on in the process. And if you go to the next slide. Thanks. So they also mapped out these buildings. And so if you look in the background of this little photo montage, you can see that they've also integrated historical information into their equity index. And that's really, really important because they're not just looking at what census tracts or communities are currently designated as a disadvantaged community, but also neighborhoods and people who have experienced historical redlining. So they associated historical redlining grades with different parts of the neighborhoods or with different neighborhoods. And that also contributed to which buildings were identified as equity priority buildings. So this other image here in front just kind of speaks to the practical use of an equity prioritization in your buildings. So they identified 490 real buildings, real properties to perform outreach with. Right? They are actually going and visiting these buildings and they're getting ASHRAE level 2 audits in these buildings. And if you look on the left on this pie chart, you can see the different makeup of these equity priority buildings. You can see a good bit of them are residential, but that there's a significant commercial building slice as well. And we're going to come back to that commercial building slice. Next slide. So the last kind of piece of this presentation is about the specific research that NREL and the labs are doing. to support jurisdictions interested in BPS, but also in this equitable implementation of BPS. So kind of coming back to that commercial building slice on that pie chart, right? Is it really that there's only 14% of under-resourced buildings in Denver, or are some of the, maybe so, right? Maybe, but maybe not. And considering that most of the research around equity has been based on residential metrics, the labs have also been really interested in investigating equity considerations in the commercial building space. So we've been working this past year or so on a pilot project in Aurora, Colorado, to investigate equity in commercial buildings. We chose Aurora, Colorado because there's a statewide building performance standard in Colorado, but also NREL is located in Colorado, so we can actually go and meet people, talk with people, and build trust in our own community. And then as well, it's a majority minority city. It's the most diverse city in the state of Colorado. So really great place to perform this research and understand these equity considerations. So we had kind of a two-pronged approach to understand equity in commercial buildings here. One was a data analysis, looking at all the commercial buildings in Aurora and identifying common equity characteristics about them, both within census tracts that are designated as disadvantaged communities and outside of them. And then on top of that, we merged those results with some of the, with community engagement, right? So just trying to make sure that this data analysis is really contextualized by the voices of people in Aurora. So we went out and made friends with some of our neighbors. We subcontracted a community-based organization, and we surveyed the public, both community members, business owners, and property owners, about which buildings, which commercial buildings meant the most to them or supported them most, and why, and then what types of services did these buildings provide to the community. Okay, next slide. And this is my last slide. So just kind of reiterating that the project I was just mentioning is going to be a replicated project. We're going to be working on this in Atlanta, Georgia this next year. And we're also going to be publishing all of these surveys, the methods, and the outreach strategies that we have kind of piloted so that other jurisdictions can use this information wherever they're implementing either building performance standards or other energy policies. So other kind of ways that both NREL and our technical assistance network are going to be supporting you are through this equity building performance standard board. So we have stood up a board of different members who are here kind of through our TA network to support any inquiries about equity or about some of these equity portfolio prioritization methods that we've outlined today that you guys may be interested in. And so I have here, just kind of in conclusion, two of the items that were listed on Denver's equity priority buildings methods were buildings that were significant to the neighborhood and buildings that provide human services to the community. So these are really two important factors that the Aurora pilot and our work in Atlanta are going to help jurisdictions identify. So that's everything. Thank you guys so much. Looking forward to any questions. You're on mute, Molly.
Thank you. Try that again. Hi, everybody. My name is Molly Curtz. I'm a research engineer with PNNL, and I'm going to be talking about building performance standards and energy codes, how those two policy types interface, how they differ, and some opportunities to coordinate them to support policy goals. Next slide, please. So both building performance standards and building energy codes are clearly critical policy tools to improve building performance. PNNL has worked to support both these types of policies. We have a long history working on innovation and greater efficiency in energy codes and continuing that push as we're moving toward net zero energy codes And then in more recent years, we have also contributed support to building performance standard policies to increase efficiency in existing buildings. And then we also contribute to DOE's technical assistance that they provide to state and localities for both energy codes and BPS as well. Next slide. So energy codes, just to orient us, it's a holistic set of requirements that outline minimum levels of efficiency by which you can legally construct a new building. It applies to new construction, and energy codes also get triggered when you do an alteration to an existing building. The code gives an indication of a building's ability to perform efficiently, but it really doesn't predict the operational energy use of the building in the future. Next slide. So I just wanted to share some of the historical context for energy codes. They have been around for a long time, and we're looking at coming up on 50 years since the first version of ASHRAE 90.1 model code was published. So that's a pretty long history. I also wanted to share, the significant improvement in energy efficiency that's occurred over that time period. But that's putting this in relation to BPS, which is quite new. We're seeing these policies come within the last 5 years or so. So that's a big difference in how long they've been around. Next slide. I just wanted to quickly touch on that for energy code, there's a wide variety of code compliance pathways. These are just 2 of them. So for prescriptive compliance, you have a set of requirements that are applied to each component of the building. If you meet those requirements, you comply. An alternate path under energy code is a performance-based path. And the intent of those performance-based path types is to offer more design flexibility to the design team, while also ensuring a roughly equivalent performance to the prescriptive path. Next slide. We're gonna skip this one. And the next one, I think those should have been taken out. So, okay, so as BPS are instituted, it really raises the question, how are these newer policies going to interface and interact with these longer standing energy code policies that people are much more used to and familiar with? So this is just sort of a timeline of kind of the early stage of a building's lifespan. There's a couple of years right at the beginning where energy codes apply during design and construction. They're at the forefront of everyone's mind. Following that, there's typically some gap here, which is the gap where the building transforms from a new building, new construction, subject to the energy code, to an existing building that is now subject to the BPS. And during that transition period, there may be a trigger for benchmarking, reporting requirements that come into effect, and there's typically just some time gap between those 2 stages. And then looking forward, off to the right, off the scope of what this map shows, will be the remainder of the building's life cycle. And we're expecting BPS requirements will continue to apply to that building at some cyclic rate throughout the remaining life cycle. And then energy code requirements could also come back into effect. That's going to be triggered by the need for a permit. So if there's a major renovation or if equipment is going to be replaced, then the energy code again becomes applicable at that point. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how these 2 policy types differ. They're both concerned with energy use in buildings, but they are different in some significant ways. So energy codes really focusing on new construction and major renovations. Building performance standards, we're focusing on existing buildings and how those are performing. Energy codes, we're going to look at the efficiency for all components that make up the building systems, HVAC, water heating, envelope components, etc. For the BPS, because that policy is performance-based, these same systems, the efficiency of those systems is very important to your ability to meet that performance goal. But there's this additional factor of how you're operating those systems and making sure that you're operating those as designed to perform efficiently. And then lastly, I want to point out kind of the difference in the timing of compliance for energy codes. You just have the 1 point of compliance at permit, and you may repeat that if there are alterations to your building, but the significant push is at the new construction build point. And then for BPS, there are multiple points of compliance throughout the life of the building. And additionally, the stringency requirements could increase throughout the life of the building and may require progressive ongoing improvement of the performance to meet the standards. Next slide. So given those differences in the policies, I wanted to talk a little bit about the different policy levers that is provided by each type of policy. So if we think about, we know that building performance is influenced by a variety of different factors. Some of the factors are addressed by energy code, but more of those factors are going to be addressed by the BPS. So if we start by looking at the inherent efficiency of the systems, how, what are the R values in the envelope? What's the efficiency of the heating system? How efficient is the lighting? Obviously, that is all addressed by the energy code requirements. It's also indirectly addressed by BPS because those systems will impact your ability to meet your performance target and meet the BPS target. So then moving on to operations and maintenance, which is kind of looking at, well, how well are those buildings are those systems in your building working? Are they operating as designed? Are they operating correctly? That is limited in terms of how much energy code addresses that. There's a little bit, some commissioning requirements are in energy codes now, or envelope air leakage testing requirements. But it's relatively limited compared to the extent that those factors are addressed by BPS, because the operation and maintenance of the building is obviously very important to the energy and emissions performance of that building. And then finally, how the building is used by occupants, and energy codes don't address this at all. So BPS is really getting into a new area here in terms of what are the operating hours, how dense is your occupancy, what types of plug-in equipment do you have, how are you setting thermostats, how are you controlling your systems? All of that is going to influence your building performance. So it becomes impacted by the BPS potentially. Next slide. So based on these policy differences that we just discussed, it really underscores that it is very important to consider both of these policies from the early stage of the design process. Meeting energy code is certainly helpful to your future ability to meet the BPS, but I would say that it's not sufficient to ensure that you will meet the BPS. And the reason I say this is because energy code compliance isn't really designed as a tool to predict real world performance outcomes. It's designed to ensure certain efficiency criterion are met. This graph here on this page is showing results from a study that PNNL did to look at how much variability there might be for different design choices along a prescriptive code compliance path. So we simulated a whole bunch of different buildings that used slightly different design choices, different HVAC systems, maybe different wall constructions, operable versus fixed windows, those sorts of variations that are all allowable by prescriptive code, and looked at how much range we would see in the building annual energy use of the energy models. So in that study, we found there was a factor of 1.7 difference between the highest energy version of that medium office prototype and the lowest energy version of that office. So it's quite significant variation under a prescriptive energy code. We also know there's differences between like an energy modeled ideal operation of a building with assumed schedules, et cetera, and the actual operation of a building. And then finally, I also wanted to mention kind of the unpredictable factors like occupant behavior, occupant installed equipment that can't really, what the weather will be, we don't know that in advance of occupancy. Next slide. So PNNL has produced a brochure on this topic of energy codes and BPS. The link is provided here on this page. PNNL is also working on a tech brief on this topic. And the brochure covers a lot of what I discussed today. It also highlights some specific guidance for jurisdictions. So I'll just highlight that for you now. Understanding typical performance for new buildings in your area. So how are these new buildings performing is a key first step to understanding how the code and BPS are going to interrelate. Another factor was recommendation to align your policy metrics. So if your energy code regulates site energy, but your BPS regulates emissions, you might want to think about using one consistent metric for those two things. Or if you don't want to do that, provide a really clear methodology for how people can convert between those two metrics in a standard fashion. Then considering the transition, that sort of gap that we looked at as the building moves from a new construction building to an existing building, how will buildings navigate that transition point, and is there a need at that stage during the startup period of a new building for more flexible compliance options? That's something to consider. And then fostering collaboration and coordination from between the code compliance department in your jurisdiction and the BPS department. So often those are separate teams, but it's really helpful to ensure that those teams are aligned in their communications and messaging and support to owners and ensure that they're working together toward the policy goals. And then supporting and educating designers and developers. And this really just goes back to my earlier slides about, we have this long history of working with energy codes and people are very familiar with that whole process and how that works. BPS is relatively new. It's really important for design teams and owners to understand, okay, this is a requirement that's going to affect the building throughout its future life, and that it's important to plan for it from an early stage. Next slide. So some more key takeaways from my part of this presentation. BPS is, we're seeing policies for BPS increasing, and we expect that that trend will continue. The focus for BPS is really on older existing buildings, but they will certainly impact new construction over the life of those buildings. So to think about ways that jurisdictions could support alignment between their energy code policy and their BPS policy, again, looking at aligning the metric to use the same in both policies. Look for opportunities to narrow the band of expected performance outcomes under the energy code. So effectively, by doing that, you can help to equip buildings for success under the BPS. And sort of, you can think about it in terms of the greater the level of your inherent system efficiencies of all the systems going into your building, the higher operational leeway that will afford you in terms of how you can run your building and still meet your performance target. Strengthening metering, commissioning, and O&M requirements in codes that can align with BPS outcome and reporting needs, and really importantly give owners and operators the tools that they need to understand the energy use in their building so that they can improve it. And then the last suggestion was to consider requiring a prediction of BPS at compliance at permit stage, and this would be based on an energy model. But this would really be a means of ensuring that design teams and owners are at least thinking about the operational phase of the building's life at the design stage. Next slide. So these are just some resource links, so you'll get these in the slideshow when it's shared. And then next slide. That's all that I have. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Molly. Thank you to all of our speakers. I know we had a couple of questions in the Q&A boxes, a couple of questions and comments in the chat. So I'm just going to go through and start throwing questions out to the team here. And if folks have more questions, please feel free to continue to throw them in there. We'll try and get to as many as we can. And just as a reminder, we will be sending these slides out. And so all of the links that were highlighted across the presentation will be available to folks once we are done. So I'm just going off of what I can see in front of me here. And here, I'll stop sharing screen so folks can see all of our faces. All right. So to answer David's question quickly, and other folks feel free to chime in, building performance standards affect any building in a jurisdiction that is covered by that policy, regardless of whether they need to perform a retrofit or continue operating and as they exist. And so that's kind of very broad, and it really depends on the specific building operations at a given time, whether they will need to perform a retrofit, but those compliance timelines that are set by these policies. And so, you know, if you have a deadline in 2025 to reach a specific performance target, those are irrespective of the specific building's plans for retrofits and all of that. Those are compliance timelines set by the regulation in that jurisdiction. And so a building owner may choose to perform a retrofit based on needing to reach that performance target, but the specific building activities are not dependent on the regulations required by that policy. So I hope that was clear enough for that. I did also want to touch back. I know, Josh, you answered some of the questions on qualifications and experience for audits being performed for some of these policies. To my understanding, that is usually set by the jurisdiction that is adopting that alternative compliance pathway, what type of requirements they'll be setting for the auditors that will be performing that audit for the building. So it could be an ASHRAE credential, it could be a certified energy manager credential or others. Anybody else have anything to add there?
Nope, I think you nailed it, Billierae. Yeah, we're happy to provide some examples of qualifications that different jurisdictions have set up. But yeah, it does very much vary region to region from that standpoint.
Great. And Isabel, I know there were some questions on language translation about all these resources. I wonder if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, definitely. So that was something I kind of skimmed over for sake of time, but our pilot in Aurora, each of the meetings were also hosted in multiple different languages. So as a majority city, there were maybe 6, 7, 8 different languages that we needed to make sure that we had interpretation for. But that also meant that each of the surveys needed to be translated into the appropriate languages. So that is reflected in our published resources for the Aurora Commercial Buildings pilot. All of those surveys will be published in the languages that they were translated into for our outreach. I also saw that Virginia mentioned a few other languages that she was interested in them being translated into. Noted. Not that all of our resources at the labs can be translated into 20, 30 different languages, but we are seeking for, in particular, some of our like de-risking series that are coming out or other guides that we create to be published in a number of key languages like French, Arabic, Chinese, maybe in Mandarin, or Spanish and English. So definitely a key area. So thank you guys for asking about that.
Great. And I did want to also respond. I don't know if everybody saw this comment, but somebody wrote in the chat about some of the challenges associated with adopting these types of robust policies for a smaller jurisdiction with more limited resources. And certainly, we do appreciate how challenging and daunting some of this effort seems to be, and certainly can be in reality as well. That was one of the reasons why we did stand up this technical assistance network for building performance standards. It was to support state and local jurisdictions across their various needs with this policy. And so we certainly encourage folks to reach out to us to receive assistance, and that could even be just an introductory conversation to understand if this policy is even applicable to your jurisdiction and your needs. And so we encourage you to reach out there, but we also have a great network of state and local jurisdictions who rely on each other as well for information sharing and lessons learned. And so we also are happy to make connections, especially in a particular geographic region of jurisdictions who you all may find commonalities in what you're trying to pursue around existing buildings policies. So in general, there's a ton of resources out there. We know it can be a little overwhelming at first, but we certainly don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we can help you wade through and understand what makes the most sense for you and your buildings. Great. Anybody else want to have a question that you all want to particularly answer? I'm just scanning here. Here's one for Molly. What analysis has been done on BPS and historical buildings? Or anyone really can answer this as well, especially in the Northeast United States.
Yeah, to my awareness, I'm not aware of any large studies on that. I am aware of case study work that was done in Boston and in New York City around development of their targets and assessing whether those targets were feasible. The other thing that I would say is I am aware that of several BPS policies that do include exemptions for historic buildings in the case where retrofits required would compromise the historic nature of the building condition. So that's one way that people have attempted to address. You mentioned a concern about ability to meet targets without fundamentally changing the historic nature of the building. So I wanted to include that I have seen some alternative compliance paths triggered by historic designations.
Great. And I'll also flag the ASHRAE conference that's scheduled for October of this year is very focused on, I am blanking on the topic. It's very focused on existing buildings, and in particular, I think it's large existing buildings or high-rise existing buildings. And so very much looking at some of those complexities around the building stock in New York City and Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, those types of jurisdictions. And so if folks are interested, definitely encourage you all to check out that ASHRAE conference series as well. Josh, I don't know if you want to chat about the commissioning activities for everybody that you're doing, but that might be a good topic as well.
Yeah, you read my mind. Yeah, so definitely a couple good questions there around this from both Jean and Christian regarding commissioning/retro commissioning opportunities and the intersection with BPS. Certainly timely, as we are looking, we're in the early stages right now of setting up a commissioning catalyzer for BPS with the inherent goal of trying to connect commissioning professionals, those that are helping to establish good operations in buildings, and tie that into BPS requirements. I think the goal is to address some of the issues. I think, Christian, that you mentioned there of unpredictability of RCX findings. I think you have similar issues with energy audits, right? You never know what you're going to uncover until you actually get in there and do it. But there is a fundamental connection there of ongoing building performance and commissioning efforts that support maintenance of that performance over time. And also represents one of the lowest hanging fruit opportunities to potentially get your building into compliance through a retro commissioning effort. And so we are going to look to highlight case studies and dive deep with certain particular regions over time to show the value there, also show the unpredictability of it, and help make those connections over time. But all good questions, and definitely encourage you all to reach out if you're interested in getting involved with our catalyzer.
And I did see a couple questions pop up around buildings where an owner may not occupy the space, but there is a leased tenant, and how that might work with how to comply with a building performance standard. I will start off by saying this is an area that is certainly a potential challenge for jurisdictions and building owners, but we are looking into how certain jurisdictions are trying to address this, namely with heavy communication and outreach to the building owners, as well as additional programmatic resources in order to help both the building owner and the tenant receive the benefits of complying with a BPS. But Isabel, I wanted to float it over to you to see if you wanted to add anything about that based on your research in Aurora.
Yeah, so I think, strip malls, just to start off, strip malls are a really important property type that we found in disadvantaged communities. And so just with that in mind, I think there's a lot of opportunity to ensure the equitable outcomes in your policy and equitable implementation in your policy, specifically in these strip malls. So there's lots of different tenant types, and so it's important to think about what the industry makeup are within those strip malls. And then also what type of rent protection you may have to support potential displacement that may occur. And I think that was also something that came up. Really happy to bring that to a further discussion also through the TA network and through our Equity BPS technical advisory group that's been stood up. There's a number of equity administrators from different places in the US who might be interested in kind of brainstorming on that with you guys.
And I'll also highlight our Better Buildings program, which is completely separate from the building performance standards work that we're doing, but is housed in the same Department of Energy offices. They do work with a lot of building owners who have a franchise model and thus have to work with their tenants in order to either meet some voluntary sustainability measures that they have internal to their company, or they're committed to the Better Climate Challenge, which is, again, a voluntary energy reduction effort with DOE, or they do have to meet a building performance standard because they are based in that location. And so, again, not a ton of information yet, but that is definitely something that colleagues across our office are attuned to, and will certainly come out with more information as these building owners and tenants work together to meet these goals. I did want to call out the question, as building owners become required to undergo retrofits to comply with the BPS, how should cities and states create equitable financing methods to help support building owners, especially for affordable housing property owners, nonprofit owners, and the like? Josh, I don't know if you have any introductory thoughts here.
Yeah, sure. I think there are definitely good examples out there on both fronts with regards to, financing and, additional support to buildings. I would call out the specific policies of City of Denver, which went through the efforts of establishing an equity index that they're using to, above a certain threshold, provide additional support to buildings in their compliance process. And then on the financing side, I think both DC and Boston, and we do mention this within the implementation guide, so I encourage you to look to that for specifics. But within Boston and DC, financing mechanisms that are targeted, utilizing sometimes, in the case of Boston, a revolving loan fund funded through projected alternative compliance payments, and or, just targeting certain, in the case of DC affordable housing retrofit accelerator, some of the specifics there, which we're going to be releasing a case study around. So there's no silver bullet answer here, but there are a lot of great examples that are out there of policy components you can put into place to support things in that way. And something the TA network is also more than happy to support your jurisdiction with.
I don't know, Isabel, if you have any other thoughts around that. I saw that you put the link to the Washington, DC multifamily affordable housing retrofit accelerator. That's a very exciting example of this work where they're combining multiple different organizations to support affordable housing, meet the compliance of requirements of their building performance standard. And so they're combining the DC government, their DC SEU, which is their version of utility efficiency programming, and their DC Green Bank in order to provide financing for this particular subset of covered buildings in their policy. But Isabel, please add any more that you want there.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I think it's really cool to see DC really targeting in on the affordable housing sector there. I'll just mention briefly maybe that there was a good bit of research that was done prior to standing up that affordable housing retrofit accelerator, big mouthful. So they worked for a while to identify all of those naturally occurring affordable housing units, as well as the subsidized housing, right? And so those two kind of groups together really informed how they designed those programs. So I just don't underestimate the kind of local research that needs to happen to design those kinds of policies in your own jurisdiction.
Great. And I know we're pretty much right at time, and there's a lot of enthusiasm in the chat. So I think I'm going to close this out at this point. But anyone, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or follow-up that you have from this webinar. I know our colleagues at PNL are planning to send out the slide deck to everybody. And again, any state or local jurisdiction who's interested in building performance standards, we have technical assistance available for you all. So please don't hesitate to reach out with your questions.